podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to The Racket Report, the podcast that tries to take you inside the world of organized crime and everything related to it. You know, it's a funny thing with organized crime because it seems like throughout American history, and I guess this could be extrapolated throughout world history, organized crime, it pops up whenever there's a need to fill a void, something that the government has made illegal, but things that people still want. I'm thinking alcohol during the era of prohibition. I'm thinking drugs during the era of the war on drugs. But I don't think there's been a better example of organized crime rising up to meet the needs, wants, and desires of the public than gambling, sports gambling specifically. Long before we saw state after state legalizing sports gambling, you would see people that would never even dream of jaywalking, people that are voting for politicians on a platform of law and order and cracking down. They would have no problem calling up a mafia-connected bookie to place a bet on the Mets or the Jets or the Giants or, well, okay, maybe not the Jets. And you would see this go on all the time. I'm curious about how the world of gambling has been affected and the world of organized crime has been affected by the increased legalization of every form of gambling you can imagine. But a lot of this begins with a sports gambling scandal that got a lot of attention. And that's the Tim Donaghy scandal. We're going to get into this with a guy that has studied gambling, the mob, law enforcement, and the nexus between all of those areas better than anybody. Dr. Sean P. Griffin. He is a professor of criminal justice at the Citadel. He's a best-selling author whose books include Gaming the Game, the story behind the NBA betting scandal, and the gambler who made it happen. He also happens to be a former Philadelphia police officer. Dr. Griffin, it's great to talk with you. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, Sean, how did you make that transition from law enforcement to academia? It's not necessarily a natural transition.
Well, it's not a very sexy story, actually. I wanted to go straight from undergraduate to graduate, but I had a lot of bills. So my father was a Philadelphia police officer. My brother was a Philadelphia police officer. And my father said, well, why don't you at least join the department, pay off some bills? So I knew when I joined, I wasn't going to be staying long. So I only stayed 4 years. And then I went back and finished my PhD and went into academia. So, I mean, look, it was an invaluable experience. The stories were hilarious and you learn a lot about bureaucracy. But I always joke, you know, if you wanted a cop in Philly, you called my brother. You didn't call me.
That's very funny. Did you have any involvement with organized crime as a cop yourself, or did your brother or father have any sort of significant involvement with the world of organized crime in Philly?
No, I was just a regular beat cop, worked great areas, but had no actual involvement with organized crime figures. My brother didn't, generally speaking, he became a homicide detective and was one for decades. And so there'd obviously be a nexus there, but he wasn't assigned to the organized crime unit or to the intelligence unit or anything like that. And my father was just a beat cop like me. So no. And it's funny because when I went into academia, everyone assumed that would play a major role in my research. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, it really didn't. It helped me a little bit in the sense that obviously I knew how the system worked. I had some context, but you know, most of my stuff was based outside of Philly anyway, so I had to develop my own sources and my own networks anyway. But yeah, it's a fluke. I mean, it was a great experience, and it looks cool on a resume, and the students love hearing about it, but it doesn't really tie much into my research.
Gotcha. Okay. Want to talk to you about your book, Gaming the Game, and this massive NBA betting scandal that a lot of our listeners will remember, but you have explored the world of organized crime a great deal. Before we get into this scandal specifically, what has the legalization of sports gambling meant for the mob, as far as you can tell?
Believe it or not, as far as we can tell, it hasn't made any difference. And I'm not shocked by that. Some people are. We especially focus on nowadays, of course, offshore sports books where you can get a lot more money down. And that's true for even your local bookies. Oftentimes they're going to want to offset their bets or place bigger bets offshore themselves. You might be placing your bet with a local bookie, but you don't know where that money's going. Well, anyway, when sports gambling was legalized, people wrongly assume that when you legalize something, you'll hear people say this. They say this about marijuana and decriminalization of drugs all the time. They'll say, well, if you legalize it, you're going to take away the opportunity for gangs or for organized crime. Mm-hmm. That's naive, because in the case of gambling, part of the benefit of betting with your local bookie is that he'll let you bet on credit. Well, a legal sports book's not going to allow you to do that. They'll work with you on odds. A legal sports book's not going to do that. So there are still many benefits that are in the underworld that don't exist in the legal world of gambling. And that's why so far the studies we've looked at have shown no impact at all on underground betting. And in fact, if you saw, there was a recent major scandal emanating out of Los Angeles with professional baseball. Those bets were placed, millions of dollars were bets were placed illegally. So even the handful of scandals we've had since legalization happened a few years ago, they've actually been underground bookies.
That is really interesting and kind of counterintuitive. So I'm glad you clarified that for us.
If you work as a manufacturing facilities engineer, installing a new piece of equipment can be as complex as the machinery itself. From prep work to alignment and testing, it's your team's job to put it all together. That's why it's good to have Grainger on your side. With industrial-grade products and next-day delivery, Grainger helps ensure you have everything you need close at hand through every step of the installation. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
All right, let's talk about your book, Gaming the Game. How'd you first become interested in the Tim Donaghy scandal, and what made you decide to write this book?
I think like many people, obviously I was watching the news and back then following ESPN a lot and thought I knew the story. And the book I had published right before then, I was out promoting my prior book, and someone had seen me on television and contacted me and said, are you going to write about the NBA betting scandal? And I thought, well, what's there to say? It's all over the news. And we know what there is to know. And he said, I think you benefit by talking to the people who are actually orchestrating this thing. And so I reluctantly agreed to a meeting with the professional gamblers who actually were the ones who orchestrated the thing. And I knew within 5 minutes, oh, my goodness, not only did I not know the story, the country didn't know the story, because what we didn't know at that point in time was that what we were fed nationally was strictly the words of Tim Donaghy, the referee. He immediately approached the Fed. So from the beginning, his word was carrying the day. The pro gamblers didn't cooperate, and they also didn't give access to the Feds, obviously, of all their electronic betting records or anything like that. Well, I was going to have access to all of that and be able to answer all the questions that everyone had that even the FBI didn't have access to.
Well, I mean, that's wild. So in your book, you paint a detailed portrait of Jimmy Baba Batista. What did you find most surprising or interesting about Batista's role in the scandal, especially considering he never spoke to federal authorities?
Well, Batista's an interesting guy, but he's very representative of that world. Batista, if you met him, you would never know that he was moving millions of dollars every day for professional gamblers all around the world. He's just a regular suburban dad. That was true for all of the people in that world. None of them were the sort of people that I research for a living. I'm an organized crime scholar, so I'm constantly meeting people in odd places, photocopying things without, with fear of people seeing me doing things. The organized crime research is a dangerous business. This was totally different. These are just regular people. And with regard to what surprised me about Batista in that world, I, again, as an organized crime guy, I'm familiar with bookies and low-level stuff on street corners or in pubs or things like that. I had never sat down in front of a computer screen and watched millions of dollars be affected by the click of a mouse. And for your audience who doesn't know this, for the people who want to bet offshore, sports books won't take $1 million bet or a $2 million bet. everywhere you go, even big offshore sports books, you have to break them down into little parcels. Well, they're always trying to monitor who's placing those bets, and they'll only allow a certain limit. Somebody like Batista's expertise was being able, and this has to happen very quickly because you don't want the worldwide sports betting market to change the betting lines before you get the rest of the money down. So his expertise was being able, in a span of minutes, to get $300,000 here, $500,000 there, $200,000 there, all over the world without people realizing he was the one doing it.
Wow. Jeez. Talk about a talent. Hey, maybe I jumped the gun a little bit by assuming people were up on the Tim Donaghy scandal and had seen the Netflix documentary. So Donaghy, just give us the kind of Reader's Digest version, the thumbnail sketch of this NBA betting scandal. I think most people know that he was a referee who conspired to fix NBA games. What are the key points about what we need to know about what Donaghy did and how this all unraveled?
Sure. Donaghy starts betting on his own games and does it for 4 years. He does it throughout the 03-04, 04-05, 05-06, and 06-07 seasons. What he doesn't know is that he's placing the bets with a friend of his, a golfing buddy of his, who has nothing to do with organized crime, has nothing even to do with pro gambling. Well, Donaghy never knew where those bets were being placed. He just knew that he was betting with his buddy. Well, that buddy was placing his bets with Batista and his crowd of multi-million-dollar professional gamblers. And it didn't take them long to realize, oh, my goodness, this person typically bets $2,000 on NBA games, and he loses just like everyone else. But he's betting $5,000 on certain NBA games, and they're winning at 78% of the time. Well, for your audience who doesn't know gambling, professional gamblers who do this for a living are thrilled if they win 52 or 53% of the time. If someone's hitting it 78% of the time, something's going on. So they immediately started looking at what was the consistency with those games. And they realized, oh, my goodness, their games officiated by Tim Donaghy, and the intermediary was a guy named Jack and Cannon. And they knew that Jack and Cannon and Donaghy were friends. And they go, oh, my gosh. And what's funny is the pro gamblers assumed that Jack Kincannon and Tim Donaghy had conspired to do something. And that wasn't true either. Kincannon was simply passing along the bets. He didn't know what was going on. So anyway, what Donaghy didn't know was that for 3 seasons, professional gamblers were betting all over the world, simply copying the bets that he was making. You flash forward to December of 2006, Donaghy complains to a friend of his that Jack Kincannon isn't paying him. That word gets to Jimmy Batista and says, well, arrange a meeting. I'll be glad to help him out. They meet at the Philadelphia International Marriott where they cut a deal. And now instead of Donaghy betting with Jack and Cannon, he's going to bet directly with Batista. And I'll do this as quickly as possible. For gambling, that's incredibly important because whereas before the professional gamblers were reliant on whenever Jack and Cannon would place the bet, now they can tell Donaghy, hey, give us the pick the night before. We want a full day to manipulate the worldwide betting markets to get the best betting propositions we can. So it dramatically changed the math and the odds of the scandal. So from December of 06 until the scandal ends in April of 07, they're betting as much money as the market around the world will take. And one thing your audience may not know, especially if they watch that awful Netflix documentary, the public has been led to believe, again, because everything in the public has pretty much been based on Donaghy. People always assume it's never said on air, but I'd love your audience, if they were thinking right now, how did the scandal end? I'll bet you they think that the FBI ended the scandal because that's the way everything's presented. That's not what happened. Jimmy Batista went into drug rehab on March 18, 2007. When he went into rehab, the conspirators say, wait, we're going to move to somebody else. So they go to another pro gambler named Pete Ruggieri. They bet for a handful of games into it through April. And then Ruggieri realizes, oh, my goodness, the betting lines on these games are moving way too much. I can't really control the market, and that's the key to making big money in that world. And B, people are going to catch on to this. So Pete Ruggieri, the pro gambler, shuts the scheme down in April. It wasn't shut down by the NBA, certainly not shut down by Donaghy, and it wasn't shut down by the FBI. They quit. They just stopped. And the only reason I bring that up is because Donaghy goes on air all the time saying, oh my gosh, the mob had its grips on me, and the FBI told me they would never let loose their golden goose. And it's all fiction. And in fact, when Pete Ruggieri shut the scheme down, what did Donaghy do? He begged to bet one more game.
That is incredible. In the world of organized crime, how does that world of high stakes gambling and bookmaking compare to more traditional criminal enterprises? Is it fair to consider Jimmy Batista and his cohorts as part of organized crime, or do they operate on sort of a different level?
Oh, that's an amazing question. Incidentally, that's why I got involved in this project. I figured if nothing else, I could solve that mystery. And they play a dance with organized crime, essentially. On the one hand, organized crime fears professional gamblers because they're the only people who can really take money out of their pockets. A local bookmaker who's not at this level of, sophistication with spreadsheets and computer algorithms and informants all over the world and all that sort of stuff, you don't want somebody like Batista or the people he worked for beating your sports book. They'll take all your money. So that's true. But it's also true, of course, that these guys are regular people. They're not violent, and they correctly live in fear of gangsters. So there was always this dance over who was going to abuse you. There's a story in the book, in fact, where a friend of theirs was murdered at one point, and they all ran in fear, assuming it was Philly wise guys who had come out to the suburbs. Now that turns out that wasn't true at all. It had nothing to do with organized crime, but they weren't naive. And then if you're in that world, you never know if somebody's upset and they think that you took money out of their pocket. So they're not at all. They have nothing to do with organized crime. The only time you could see a nexus, if you want to say it that way, they bet in such large quantities that sometimes people will want to look to move money or offset bets. And at that level, you could see intermediaries. But even there, plenty of times, it's sort of like if you bet with your local sports book, you probably don't know who she or he is dealing with, even if they're mobbed up. Same thing here. When you're dealing with money managers, you may not know, oh my gosh, that guy's working in New York. Oh my goodness, that guy's working out. You don't really know. But technically speaking, that is the only nexus I ever discovered in all the years of looking into that.
A lot of us assume that professional sports are strictly regulated to avoid betting-related corruption, especially in the aftermath of Pete Rose, who just passed away, and all that sort of thing. Based on your research, do you think that the NBA and maybe even the other sports leagues have sufficiently addressed the vulnerabilities that allowed the Donaghy scandal to happen, or are we still at risk of something similar like this happening today?
I love these questions. If you had asked me that back in 2011 when Game in the Game came out, I would have had a different answer. My answer is probably yes. They probably do have systems in place now that are sufficient. Incidentally, I have an entire section of my website that's devoted to all of the scandals that have been disclosed, not only in professional sports, but in the NCAA since legalization. And the reason for that is part of the condition of all the states who legalized gambling was that they instituted a system whereby the leagues and the NCAA share data with firms. I don't want to name them and give them hype, but there are two or three prominent international firms, and all they do is look for anomalies in things like betting lines and play-by-play action. That was one thing that I was shocked when I took on this project years ago. You've got people betting all over the world on simple things like football and tennis. We're focusing on the outcome of a Giants game. There are people who are betting the minutia inside the game, and they now have data and analytics in real time that are looking to flag those things. And that's how all these scandals have been discovered. Whereas years ago, of course, it would take informants or wiretaps and all the things that your audience probably used to. Nowadays, they're literally just monitoring a blizzard of data in real time and flagging anomalies.
By the way, if people are interested in checking out your website and to see what you just referenced or anything else that's on there, there's some great stuff on there. Then go to SeanPatrickGriffin.net. It's SEAN, SeanPatrickGriffin.net. You alluded to how different the Donaghy version of events is and what a skewed perspective that those of us that have seen the Netflix documentary have from reality. You've had access to confidential law enforcement files and records from this case. What was the most revealing piece of evidence that changed the way you understood the scandal?
Well, if I had to pick one thing, I would say Batista's laptop. I got access to Batista's laptop and all the electronic betting records. And once you see the math, it's no longer a he said story. You're just literally looking at the bets. And I describe a handful of them in the book, where I actually walk the reader through how it works, when the bets are placed, where they're placed, how he's moving the markets around the world. And the moment you see that, it's irrefutable. It's time-stamped electronic data, and that flies in the face of it with regard to the sociology of the betting, everything that happened. So I would say that's number one. The other thing is, when I interviewed the guys who worked the case for the FBI, they were awesome. This is something that I think most people would be shocked to hear. They looked at the NBA betting scandal as a nuisance case. People on the outside wrongly think that FBI agents were all fired up. Oh, my goodness, we've got this grant. Don't forget, these are organized crime guys in New York who are doing real stuff. They get this white-collar, pain-in-the-neck gambling case in the suburbs of Philly, and they have to keep traveling down there. And they just wanted this over. So when Donaghy approached them with this plea deal and was willing to proffer, they said, fine. So when I got to interview them, they were walking me through what they thought the limitations of their investigation were. And then I got to tell them all the things I learned. So that part was fascinating, because once you hear the FBI guys and the U.S. attorney's officials explaining the weaknesses and how they wanted to, just be done with this thing, you can understand why we were all so misled at the beginning. Because if you're assuming that they're vetting Donaghy, which they didn't do, or that they're taking it seriously, well, yeah, all of our assumptions are wrong and your eyes are open.
You talk about what the sports leagues have done to kind of catch up to the corruption related to gambling and things like that. In the case of bookmaking operations, do you think law enforcement is still playing catch up with the way these criminal networks evolve and adapt, especially in an age of online and, as you pointed out, offshore betting? Is law enforcement well equipped in this day and age to be on top of this kind of thing?
I don't think so. The only reason I don't say yes or no is because I haven't spoken with them in a few years. But the last time I was speaking with law enforcement, well, first of all, at the local level, now NYPD is elite, so maybe they do. I don't know. But I can tell you in Philly, they didn't. Everywhere else I looked, they didn't. Local law enforcement has no idea about anything about this. But even with the FBI, it was incredible what I learned when I researched how they try to deal with the scandal. For your audience, especially at the Racket Report, they're probably familiar with this, but, law enforcement is very segmented. So, you might have a white-collar crime unit or a securities fraud unit or an organized crime unit. Well, think through it. Nobody actually has a gambling unit because it's typically assumed to be organized crime. So they'll research it from an organized crime perspective and investigate it, and it happens to be gambling. But they would do that for loan sharking, murder, or anything else. It's not. Well, here you had an international betting scandal where you had millions of dollars being laundered every day, tax evasion, all sorts of stuff, even, beyond the NBA betting scandal, the actual fixing of games. And the FBI didn't know how to treat that organizationally. And I interviewed the one person, I forget his title. It was something like crypto racketeering. And they literally shuttled this guy all around the country for unique cases like this that don't fit into a terrorism case or a securities fraud case or any one of their, stovepipes, because he was one of the few people who could actually walk through, oh, yeah, if you're going to launder money offshore, they're going to do this. And here's the betting apparatus and all that. It's very, very complicated. And that's one of the things that the public doesn't grasp. People can understand, like, I can go online and click offshore and bet money. No one ever gets to think, yeah, wait, how is all that money coming back onshore?
Right.
Where is it being brought back onshore? Who's trafficking it around the country? Because all that happens, of course, is you'll get a phone call or a text. Hey, I'll meet you at the Bellagio, or I'll meet you wherever. There are only a handful of Jaffa's places in the country. And you'll meet someone there. Well, that person is literally responsible for millions and millions of dollars for that region of the country. And it's from all that offshore sports betting money.
What role do you think the public perception plays in how we view organized crime in sports versus more traditional forms of organized crime, like drug trafficking or extortion or other things that you've covered?
Well, with organized crime in sports, obviously we know the handful of sensational cases but I think that's why we know them. They're noteworthy and sensational. I think
Right, like the 1919 World Series, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and like with my guys, one of the things I describe in Game in the Game, for people who are literally doing this for a living, information is commerce. So when they have so many people who owe them money because they've lost bets, obviously most people lose. Well, a lot of them can't pay. They would have people pay back with information. So it didn't matter if it was a college coach in football or college. There were examples of those, plenty of players. Now, it wasn't fixing games per se, but it was definitely things that were unethical and not allowed by the NCAA or by the pro leagues. And there's an entire universe of information being trafficked that way that most people aren't even aware of. And now that we have legalized sports betting, prop betting, and fantasy sports in the United States, that stuff is incredibly powerful, because whereas we used to focus on game outcomes and go, oh my gosh, that game was rigged. Well, you probably saw the scandal involving Jonte Porter in the NBA earlier this year, where that scandal was, how many minutes is he going to play? How many points is he going to score? It's an inside the game hustle. Well, that's where that information is invaluable. You don't even have to have a player actually do what he allegedly did. You can just get someone to tell you, yeah, as far as I can tell, the coach isn't going to play me this much this week. We're doing this sort of scheme. And you can use that to your advantage in ways you couldn't 10 years ago. So that's happening, having nothing to do with organized crime. Now, I'm not naive. I don't doubt that organized crime guys can do the same thing, but just not on the scale that these pro gamblers do.
You know, you've also written about the Philadelphia Black Mafia and a book that just celebrated its 20th anniversary, Black Brothers, Inc. And I'd love to have you back for a more extensive interview to discuss that. But in your analysis, your research of the Philadelphia Black Mafia, you explore the intersection of crime, politics, society. Do you see any similar intersections when it comes to white collar crime like securities fraud or gambling scandals?
I see it. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I write about that extensively and I lecture about it all the time. Yeah. It's remarkable. You know, in this era where we're now finally talking more publicly about things like regulatory capture, where government agencies are a revolving door between regulators and people they're supposed to be regulating, it happens all the time. So, yeah, I see direct parallels to that. And the thing is, I'm happy that people are finally coming awake. You know, I could write something about organized crime. It gets clicks, views, all that sort of stuff. My organized crime class is full. White collar crime has never been as sexy, even though you could argue it's way more important. It's literally dictating the way we live. It influences our taxes, our cost of living, all that sort of stuff. And no, there's a huge nexus between politics and white collar crime. In fact, if you study white collar crime for a living, there's an entire library part of our discipline that's just for that. It's a shame, but more and more people, thankfully, are paying attention.
Lastly, Sean, and I've enjoyed this conversation very much, and I'd love to do a part 2 to talk about the Philadelphia Black Mafia, maybe next week or whenever you can squeeze me in. But there's been a lot of very good gambling movies over the years about sports gambling specifically. From your research and from your analysis, could you tell what you think is the most accurate film as it relates to sports gambling in general?
Oh, this is terrible. I've so enjoyed this interview, and I'm going to give you a flop for a last answer because
come on, it's okay.
I know I don't have one. I can't even think of one. The only one I can even think of is Casino, and that one, of course, is not really even about gambling. Oh, I take that back. The beginning of the movie where they're talking about Ace and him being good at getting inside information and moving money and moving betting lines, that's accurate. So I'll say Casino, but I'm sure there are plenty of others that I'm not aware of.
We'll take it. We'll take it. Sean Patrick Griffin, you got to check out his books. You can go to seanpatrickgriffin.net and a whole world opens up. You can learn about not only the Tim Donaghy scandal, but the Philadelphia Black Mafia and everything else. Sean, let's talk again soon.
Look forward to it.
If somebody sent you this podcast, do us a favor and pass it on to a friend of yours. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast. Just search The Racket Report on iTunes, Spotify, absolutely anywhere. And every time there is a new episode, it will be downloaded to your phone instantly, just like that. Until the next time we meet in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.
Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But D.C. politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.